When Anastasia Palaszczuk became Premier, she said she'd act with integrity and honesty. Her actions show she has changed after media reports that self-confessed electoral rorter and former Labor MP Mike Kaiser is being considered for appointment to the role as the Premier's Director-General. This comes after the Palaszczuk government has already elevated Mike Kaiser to other senior Director-General roles. Premier Peter Beattie displayed higher standards than Premier Palaszczuk after the damning evidence and findings were presented at the Shepparton inquiry into electoral fraud. Peter Beattie said he didn't want people who break the law in the Labor Party. He said, and I quote, "I don't care whether this goes back to 1917. If people are still alive and they've broken the law in these electoral matters, they should go to jail." End quote. Premier Palaszczuk obviously doesn't agree with this higher standard of integrity about the electoral system. But let's look at what happened, as we should never forget, because integrity mattered then and it matters today. This Shepparton inquiry confirmed Mike Kaiser's role as an electoral rorter, who at first denied falsifying enrolments, but who eventually resigned from Parliament after evidence presented to the inquiry showed that he had. The inquiry also found a systematically corrupt culture of branch stacking, vote rigging and falsification of electoral enrolments within the Queensland branch of the Labor Party. Inquiry Commissioner Tom Shepparton QC determined that Mike Kaiser's conduct constituted the offence of making a false declaration under Section 117 of the Queensland Election Act. Because this offence was statute barred and the time limit to prosecute had passed, he could not be prosecuted. Let's be clear, Mike Kaiser was adversely named, as were the practices he and other Labor MPs and identities indulged in using false electoral enrolments. Anyone who downplays this as a minor issue or just a youthful indiscretion is making excuses for the serious business of electoral fraud. Electoral fraud, which corrupts the integrity of the voting system. The Premier and her government try to make out it's nothing to see here and you shouldn't bring up the past of Mike Kaiser, this damning past of a self-confessed electoral rorter. But you can't whitewash this history and say it didn't happen. You can't say, oh, we shouldn't talk about it because the rules of this parliament don't allow us to talk about it. Well, that's a dodgy interpretation, if ever I've heard a dodgy interpretation about a dodgy history, which we should be shouting from the rooftops. Peter Coldrake said, let the sun shine in his investigation into the culture of bullying of public servants and cover-up by this Labor government. Premier Palaszczuk's actions are as good as saying, let the vote rorters in. When Labor says, don't talk about it, that shows they're not sorry, they're not listening, and they don't get it. Integrity matters. It matters because it's about how and why government makes decisions for Queenslanders, or are they making them for Queenslanders or for themselves? And we've seen that they have a track record of governing for their mates, governing to keep their own political hide safe, and not governing for the safety of Queenslanders. Integrity of government is about governing for Queenslanders first rather than your mates first. And the elevation of self-confessed vote rorter Mike Kaiser tells us more about the Premier than it does about Mike Kaiser. It tells us about her priorities, about how she's more interested in winning the next election than addressing the chaos in the way that her government has let Queenslanders down. This is a chaotic government in turmoil who keeps struggling to deal with Queenslanders' youth justice crisis, the health crisis and the housing crisis, which are all they're making because they failed to act in a timely way and they were looking after themselves rather than after Queenslanders. But they also have an integrity crisis. It's time for the Premier to rule out Mike Kaiser, self-confessed vote rorter, as her next DG. It's time to rule out because electoral roiding is not an insignificant issue. It
Time's
matters to
expired.
Queenslanders.
Time's expired.